Over 34 million Americans watched it unfold live. A national broadcast, two towering voices, and in just 9 seconds, something shifted. Kamala Harris laughed, not at a policy, not at a plan, but at a man's belief. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. No retort, no applause line, just a pause. Then came one verse, quiet, ancient, unforgettable, from the book of Isaiah. And just like that, the room full of power, cameras, and certainty fell silent. The moderator froze. The audience leaned forward, and across the country, millions asked themselves, did we just witness a moment of truth? What followed wasn't just a comeback. It was a reminder. That conviction doesn't always shout, it just refuses to move. This story isn't a newsreel, it's a retelling. A dramatized account of what could have happened, built on real names, imagined moments, and emotions that feel all too familiar. Because sometimes fiction doesn't escape the truth. It gets us closer to it. The facts are shaped, the feelings, entirely yours to carry. Stay with us, because this isn't just his story, it might be yours too. The email came folded, not forwarded, tucked into a plain manila envelope, no markings, no sender. Just a red wax seal like something out of another century, barely holding the flap closed. It sat waiting on the edge of J.D. Vance's apartment door, half lit by the flickering hallway bulb of a D.C. building that had long outlived its charm. J.D. crouched to pick it up. He paused. His name wasn't written anywhere. He turned it over, still blank. But something told him this wasn't junk. It wasn't mail. It was a message. Inside the apartment, the light was dim, on purpose. J.D. didn't care for overheads. A single desk lamp cast a warm glow over the corner of the room, where 3 books remained half-read, and a legal pad bore the weight of unfinished thoughts. On the wall above, taped to a nail, was a faded photograph of his grandmother holding a Bible in one hand and a cigarette in the other. She looked half amused, half invincible. He slid his thumb under the flap and broke the seal. There were only 3 pages. At first glance, it looked like any generic political prep memo, headers, bullet points, talking angles. But his eyes caught the words fast. Anticipate Vance invoking religious anecdotes. Use tone to suggest he's out of touch with modern voters. If faith is mentioned, pivot. We govern for all Americans, not just the faithful. Consider subtle laughter or eye roll. Audience picks up on body language. Final reminder, paint him as a man of nostalgia, not leadership. He blinked, read it again. There was no signature, but the watermark at the bottom of the last page confirmed everything. Official stationery from the Harris for America campaign, confidential, internal use only. J.D. sat down slowly. He didn't frown, didn't clench his jaw, didn't reach for a phone. He just stared at the paper. His hand hovered over the edge of the table. One knock could have sent his coffee flying. He didn't move. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of a cheap refrigerator and the tick of a wristwatch he no longer wore. Then his eyes narrowed, not in anger, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes not when someone insults you to your face, but when they prepare to do it publicly, believing no one will ever find out. What kind of political machine builds its strategy around mocking a man's faith? And more urgently, who sent this? And why now? J.D. leaned back, hands crossed in front of him. The soft chair creaked, a lonely noise in a room full of questions. The memo had arrived just 48 hours before his live televised debate with Kamala Harris. Coincidence didn't live in Washington. He studied the phrasing again. Subtle laughter, eye roll, not policy, not arguments, optics, mockery, personal targeting. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to humiliate, and maybe that was the real warning in the envelope. Not the memo, but the motive. His phone buzzed across the table. Unknown number. He stared at it. Let it ring. Whoever sent the document wasn't looking for credit. They were sounding an alarm. But was it an ally inside her camp, or someone with their own agenda? J.D. finally rose, placed the memo into a thin leather folder, and slid it behind a copy of the Constitution that sat on his bookshelf. He looked once more at the photo on the wall, his grandmother, the Bible, the cigarette, and muttered to himself, "You told me they'd come for it, but not like this." The lights flickered again, and somewhere in the city, someone else was watching the clock, waiting to see what JD would do with what he now knew. He hadn't answered yet, but he'd been called. He drove all night without saying a word. The sky over Ohio was the color of cooling iron, blue where it once burned orange, now dulled by fog. JD didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need noise. The hum of the road and the low rhythm of his thoughts were enough. When he pulled into the gravel lot behind the church, it was just past 6 a.m. The town hadn't woken yet. No footsteps on sidewalks, no bells from downtown. Just a crow watching him from the steeple, still as a gargoyle. JD killed the engine and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath his boots like breaking glass. The church was exactly as he remembered, and worse. The white paint on the siding had faded to bone gray. The wooden doors leaned slightly inward, tired hinges groaning even before he touched them. A stained glass window above the entry bore a jagged crack through the image of a lamb. He paused there, just long enough to notice it, then pushed the doors open. Inside, the air was cold and familiar, the scent of old wood, paper hymnals, and time itself. Dust hung suspended in rays of light filtering through fractured panes. The pews stretched out like silent witnesses, splintered, empty, untouched. No choir, no candles, just the groan of the floorboards acknowledging his return. JD walked down the center aisle slowly, the echo of each footstep stretching far past what felt reasonable. He didn't rush. He let the silence thicken. The church didn't ask questions. It never had. That's what made it holy. He reached the third pew from the front. It was still there, just like it was every Sunday, when he was small enough to swing his legs beneath it without touching the floor. He sat, ran his hand along the backrest. A faint ridge remained, carved by his cousin's pocket knife long ago. "Truth lives quiet," it read. That was hers, his grandmother, the one who dragged him here before he understood what sin or salvation even meant. She used to keep a peppermint in her Bible and slip it to him during the long sermons. She didn't pray loud, but she prayed sharp. She told him once, when a preacher barked fire and brimstone, "Truth doesn't need volume, JD. It just needs backbone." He looked up at the pulpit, empty, clean but unloved. The microphone tilted like a forgotten promise. No one was coming to fill the space today, and so he knelt. No cameras, no podium, no press releases, just knees on cold wood and memory standing taller than shame. He didn't speak, not at first. He breathed. He let the dust settle on his shoulders like old prayers. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, he whispered, "They're going to try and laugh it out of me." He paused, no response, only the creak of beams above. "But you already knew that." His hand brushed the pocket of his coat. The edge of the leaked memo was still there, folded sharp, tucked beside a folded piece of lined paper. A verse scribbled by a younger version of himself. "Woe to those who call evil good." He didn't unfold it. He didn't need to. What mattered now wasn't what Kamala Harris planned to say on stage. What mattered was whether he still believed he could stand up and not blink when she said it. Behind him, a door creaked softly. Wind, age, or something more. JD stood. No decision had been made out loud, but something in him had already answered. 15 floors above DC, the windows gleamed too perfectly for the hour. The skyline behind them was washed in the pale blush of early morning, but the light inside Kamala Harris's downtown campaign office was cold, fluorescent, and surgical. Like the people in the room preferred control over warmth. Kamala sat at the end of a long glass conference table, notepad in front of her, pen tapping like a metronome. Precise, rhythmic, never quite impatient, but close. Her blazer was slate blue, her blouse a stark ivory. Every line of her appearance looked engineered for the camera. The coffee was already cold. So was the mood. Across from her, a cluster of senior aides hunched over laptops and debate prep folders, firing off points like artillery. Economy, climate, immigration. But none of it was sticking. None of it felt sharp enough. What they wanted now wasn't defense. They wanted domination. Vance is coming in with that Rust Belt savior thing again. one advisor muttered, flipping through her notes. All family values, all faith and fire. We need to cut that off at the knees. A junior aide leaned in, voice low but eager. Make him sound like he's campaigning for pastor, not senator. Kamala didn't react at first. She just glanced out the window, her eyes following the soft blue curve of the Potomac. Then slowly her lips curled into a cool smile. She turned back to the room. Let's remind the country, she said evenly, what century we live in. Laughter rippled through the team, a few nods. One aide clapped his hands softly, like they'd just rehearsed a Broadway line. But not everyone smiled. In the corner, a digital strategist named Lena stayed silent. Her fingers hovered above her keyboard, unmoving. Kamala clocked it. You disagree? She asked, casually but direct. Lena looked up. No, ma'am. Just wondering how it plays outside this room. Faith's not a weakness to some people. It's the only thing they think they have left. Kamala didn't blink. We're not attacking faith. We're attacking performance. And we're doing it with poise. She turned to the mirror on the far wall and practiced a slight shrug, the kind that says, I'm above this. The kind that would play perfectly on camera when JD started quoting scripture. That's what they expected from him. That's what she was ready for. Still, Lena scribbled a note under the table. Test optics on ridicule line. Too cold? Kamala's lead communications officer circled back in. Okay, next line. If he brings up the opioid epidemic, pivot to funding gaps in faith-based recovery. Undermine the emotion. Reframe the logic. We want him looking nostalgic, not credible. Tone is everything, someone chimed in. Kamala nodded. Always is. But her thoughts were already somewhere else. She knew JD wouldn't bite easily. He didn't shout, didn't posture. That made him more dangerous. His power wasn't volume, it was gravity. He had a way of pulling people back into the past and making it feel noble again. The trick wasn't just to beat him, it was to make the audience wonder if he ever belonged in the present at all. She rose from her chair, walked to the window and stared down at the city. It was starting to wake up, cars moving in blur, people on sidewalks, cameras already being mounted for the evening news. Somewhere down there, he was preparing too. She wondered if he'd heard yet, if he'd seen the memo. Then again, it didn't matter. Even if he had, it wouldn't change her plan. She would smile. She would be reasonable. And when he reached for God, she'd reach for America's future. She turned back to her team, the smile still holding. Let's go win a debate. The studio was colder than expected, not just in temperature, but in spirit, sterile, polished, and thick with unspoken tension. The backdrop was a sweeping American flag, subtly animated by a low fan that gave the illusion of wind. Beneath it, a sleek stage lined with LED lights pulsed faintly under the camera's glow. Everything looked perfect on screen, but in person, it all felt like cardboard dressed in pride. JD Vance stood off stage, rubbing his hands together slowly. Not because he was nervous, though maybe he was, but because the heat from the lights had nothing to do with warmth. His tie was slightly off-center, his lapel a little creased. He'd pressed the suit himself that morning. No handler had adjusted his collar, no makeup artist had powdered his skin. He looked like a man who'd just driven through Middle America, and in some ways he had. Kamala Harris entered from the opposite wing. Her stride was measured, calculated, silent on the soft flooring. Her suit shimmered faintly under the tungsten lights, deep navy with a platinum brooch that caught the camera just enough to hold it. She didn't look at JD right away. She acknowledged the moderator first, then turned to face him. The smile came easy. JD offered his hand. She took it, one shake, firm, brief, cold. Cameras flashed like lightning behind glass. The moderator welcomed the national audience, her voice smooth, practiced. Somewhere across the country, millions leaned forward with dinner plates balanced on their knees. Some waited for a fight. Others hoped for truth. Most didn't know what to expect, but all of them would remember what came next. Let's begin, the moderator said. Senator Harris, Mr. Vance, thank you for being here tonight. Our first question is simple, but foundational. What guides your vision for America? Kamala responded first. Her voice was velvet over steel, polished without sounding robotic. Progress, she said with a confident nod. My vision is guided by the future, by equity, innovation, climate responsibility, and a government that leaves no one behind. We've made it this far because we've dared to move forward, and we'll keep doing that, together. A smattering of applause followed. The sound team had warned against clapping, but it happened anyway. The moment was clean, well lit, delivered like a closing line from a commercial. JD didn't flinch. The camera swung to him. His expression was unreadable, not stiff, just still. He didn't blink as quickly as Kamala, didn't pace his words the same way. But when he spoke, the room leaned forward, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. My vision, JD said quietly, comes from the people I buried and the ones I promised I wouldn't forget. A hush settled, not heavy, but intentional. I grew up in towns where progress didn't come, he continued, where factories closed, where churches locked their doors, and where people held on, not to politics, but to faith, family, and the hope that someone, somewhere, still remembered them. The cameras held close on his face. There was no smirk, no punchline, no soaring rhetoric, just a man saying things the room wasn't used to hearing on national television. Kamala tilted her head slightly, just enough to show amusement. JD noticed. He didn't break stride. So what guides me, he said. Conviction, memory, and the belief that truth doesn't change with approval ratings? There was no applause, just the light clicking of camera shutters. Two visions had been laid bare. The lights above burned hotter now, not because the temperature had changed, but because the stakes finally had. Kamala didn't miss a beat. As the moderator transitioned to the next topic, core values and the role of belief in governance, she leaned slightly forward, just enough to project engagement, just enough for the cameras to catch the light in her eyes. Her voice was steady, warm on the surface. I believe Americans want leadership grounded in facts, she said, pausing just long enough for breath and impact. Not fairy tales from ancient texts. There it was. The smile followed, slight, polished, knowing. It wasn't a smirk. That would have been too easy to call out. It was subtler than that, closer to the practiced expression of someone offering a reasonable idea while pulling the rug out from under you. There was a flicker of reaction in the room, a few soft chuckles. Not laughter exactly. Something safer, more social. Nervous. Like people wanted to show approval without being the first to applaud. But not everyone smiled. A veteran in the third row lowered his gaze. A woman in a red coat sitting behind a news anchor's camera shook her head just enough for it to mean something, even if no one noticed. JD noticed. He didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, only slightly. A single pulse in his temple shifted beneath the surface of his skin. His hands remained on the podium, motionless. The same way his grandmother used to hold a teacup when someone at church said something deeply wrong. The moderator turned to him. Mr. Vance, your response? JD lifted his eyes to meet Kamala's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. And he didn't launch into scripture, as many might have expected. Instead, he did something far more unsettling in a room designed for noise. He nodded, just once. A simple, slow, deliberate nod. He let the silence breathe. Let the audience sit in it. The camera angle shifted ever so slightly, catching his profile, stern, still, like stone. Thank you, JD said at last, for clarifying where you stand. That was it. No sermon, no quote. Just a simple acknowledgement that her words had been received and that they'd land somewhere deeper than a soundbite. Kamala blinked. It was brief, but the shift in her eyes betrayed something. Not panic, not guilt, but the realization that perhaps her dagger hadn't gone unnoticed after all. The moderator moved on, unaware of the shift in air. Questions about policy reform filled the next few minutes. Talking points traded places like dancers who knew their marks. But the mood had shifted. JD had barely moved, but he had pulled something out of the room and into the open. Across the country, people felt it. In diners, in barbershops, in quiet bedrooms with the volume turned up too loud. Not everyone could articulate it, but they felt something under the exchange, something that didn't belong on a stage but had found its way there anyway. In JD's home state of Ohio, a retired pastor clicked pause on his TV. He sat in silence for a few seconds, then whispered, "He heard it too." And somewhere else, a teenager who had nearly lost his father to addiction stared at the screen, not at JD's words, but at his silence. That was the thing about dignity. It didn't need to shout. It just needed to stand still long enough for people to feel it. 2 states away from the debate stage, in a Rust Belt town most maps don't bother labeling anymore, a small living room glowed with the blue light of a flat-screen TV that had seen better days. The screen flickered every few minutes, not from a bad signal, but from age, in the way cold settles into electronics, just like it does into bones. Harold sat in a recliner that creaked whenever he shifted, though lately he didn't shift much. The army had taken a piece of his spine in Iraq, and factory work had taken what was left of his knees. Now the VA sent him checks that arrived late and pain pills that barely worked. But tonight he'd stayed awake for the debate, something he hadn't done in years. Not for politics, for JD Vance. The remote rested on his lap, untouched. He had watched it all, the smiles, the sound bites, the flickering arrogance that had passed for policy. But it was one moment that pulled him upright, slow and aching, like he'd forgotten how to sit tall. Kamala's words had hit him first, soft on the surface, sharp beneath. Not fairy tales from ancient texts. He hadn't spoken then, just narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw the way he used to when a lieutenant disrespected someone downrank. But when JD responded, not with fire, but with silence, that's when something old stirred in him. Not rage, not pride, just memory. And then, softly, Harold whispered into the empty room, "They're laughing at men like me." He said it without bitterness, just recognition. Not as a victim, but as someone who knew when he'd been marked. He reached for the remote, paused, then rewound the footage 15 seconds. Watched it again. JD's face, that quiet stare, that nod. Not a rebuttal, a reminder. Harold watched it 3 times, the same way he'd once replayed war footage, frame by frame, just to understand what had gone wrong. Only this time something felt right. He didn't know JD personally, never met him, but he knew the towns he came from, knew the ache of being dismissed as too religious, too broken, too far behind, knew the sting of people who mistook faith for weakness. His eyes drifted across the room. On the shelf sat a folded flag in a glass case. Next to it, an old Bible. Same one his mother used to read from, before the cancer took her. He hadn't opened it in years, until tonight. Harold leaned forward and reached for it. The leather binding cracked and stiff. He flipped it open without looking, and the pages landed, by chance or something more, on Isaiah. He ran a hand across the passage, not reading aloud, just letting the words settle into his calloused palm. Woe to those who call evil good. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, but his hand stayed there, heavy, as if the verse itself had weight. Outside, the wind scraped against the aluminum siding. Inside, the debate continued in the background, voices rising and falling like scripted music. But Harold no longer listened. He turned the TV off. Darkness returned to the room, but it didn't feel empty. For the first time in a long while, it felt full, not of answers, but of something older than anger, older than politics, conviction. He looked down once more at the Bible in his lap, then over at the flag folded beside it, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them. The question came from a moderator, but it might as well have come from the country itself. How has personal experience shaped the way you lead? Kamala gave her answer first. She spoke about time spent working with underserved communities, about being raised by immigrant parents, about facts, frameworks, and justice through systemic reform. Her delivery was elegant, measured. Her voice rose and fell like it knew the music by heart. It landed well, polished and sure. Then it was JD's turn. He didn't speak immediately. He looked down, then up, like he was checking something inside before offering it aloud. The room didn't expect the pause. Neither did the cameras. He rested one hand lightly on the edge of the podium. The other stayed at his side, fingers lightly tapping his thigh. Not out of nerves, but rhythm. Familiar. Steady. My mother, JD began, was addicted to oxycodone for most of my childhood. Silence. She tried. She failed. She tried again. I don't remember many stable mornings, but I remember one in particular, after I found her slumped over the kitchen counter. The room stopped breathing. I was maybe 11. I thought she was dead. I ran to the neighbors, barefoot in the snow. They called someone. She lived, that time. A pause, not for drama, but because it still cost something to say. Later that night, I sat on the floor of my room. The heat had been shut off again, and I opened the only thing in the house that felt warm. His voice didn't waver, but it softened. It was a Bible she kept on the windowsill. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I needed something to feel like it could survive this world. The moderator said nothing. Neither did Kamala. The audience leaned in, silently relearning how to listen. I landed on a passage in Isaiah. I didn't understand all of it, but one line stayed with me. It still does. He didn't quote it. Not yet. He let it hang. And just when the moment reached full stillness, Kamala spoke. Clear, confident, the edge in her tone wrapped in silk. Stories are touching, she said, but policy builds bridges, not prayers. There it was again. This time the laughter was cautious. It started in 2 places, maybe 3. A few heads turned, unsure whether to smile or shift. The sound rose, but not like before. It rose like a balloon no one had the confidence to let go of fully. JD didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He nodded once, like he had before. Bridges are important, he said, but you might want to ask what's waiting on the other side before you build them. There was no laugh after that, no counterpoint, just the quiet acknowledgement that some stories aren't offered to win points, but to explain how someone's still standing at all. In a control room backstage, a technician glanced at his director. "Did you feel that?" he asked. The director didn't look away from the monitor. "Yeah," she said. "That landed somewhere deeper than policy." The floor tiles were speckled beige, scuffed white in the middle, like 100,000 shoes had come and gone before him. JD sat in a molded plastic chair that cracked when he leaned forward. He was 15, wearing a gray hoodie 2 sizes too big and jeans that didn't fit the waist anymore. His shoes were soaked. He'd run 3 blocks in slush, not even noticing the snow melting into his socks. His hands were red from the cold, trembling from adrenaline, maybe shame. He hadn't cried, not yet. The hospital waiting room was a collection of bad lighting and worse wallpaper. There was a buzzing TV mounted in the corner, playing a soap opera that no one was watching. 2 other people sat across the room, neither speaking. One stared at the floor. The other blinked without focus. A nurse came through the side door and paused when she saw him. "J.D. Vance?" He stood up quickly. She didn't smile, but she didn't look harsh either. Her name tag read, S. Gable, R.N. Her eyes were the color of smoke, not cruel, just worn. "She's stable," she said. "For now." He exhaled, but it didn't bring relief, only questions. "Can I see her?" "Soon. She's under sedation." The nurse paused, looked at his shoes. "You're soaked." He nodded. She glanced at the chairs, then back at him. "Do you need a coat or something hot?" He shook his head. "I'm fine." She studied him for a second longer, then reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out something small. A faded, creased, pocket-sized Bible. The corners were bent. The gold along the page edges was worn off. "I don't give this to everyone," she said, voice quiet, "but you look like you might actually open it." He took it, unsure what to say. She gave a nod toward the back cover. "Start with Isaiah. It's steadier than grief." Then she turned and left him alone again, the little book warm from her pocket. JD sat back down. The cover felt too soft for something so heavy. He opened it to the place she'd marked with a worn-out receipt. Isaiah. He scanned. Not reading, not really. Just hoping something might rise off the page and speak loud enough to interrupt the world. Then his eyes stopped on one line. "Woe to those who call evil good, and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." Isaiah 5:20. He read it once, then again. There was no thunder, no warmth spreading through his chest. Just a sentence that sounded exactly like what the world felt like. Crooked, upside down, like something was off and no one seemed to notice. He didn't fully understand the verse, but he understood the warning, and something about it made the weight on his chest lift. Not vanish, but shift, like it had been acknowledged. He read it a third time and mouthed the words without speaking. Woe to those! His voice caught halfway through. Then he closed the Bible. He didn't keep it because it was sacred. He kept it because it didn't lie to him. It didn't promise safety. It didn't wrap pain in soft language. It just said what was true, even when truth hurt to say. He tucked it into the front pocket of his hoodie and sat back, spine straightening just a little. When they let him in to see his mother an hour later, he still didn't cry. But he wasn't empty anymore. He was carrying something now, something no one could take from him. The next question should have moved the room forward. It didn't. The moderator barely finished her sentence. Let's turn now to the economy and the future of American industry. Before Kamala pivoted sharply, her voice remained smooth, her delivery effortless, but the edge was unmistakable. Let's also remember that belief doesn't balance a budget, she added, flashing a diplomatic smile. We need real frameworks, not fables. Another ripple of restrained laughter, controlled, but now fraying at the edges. Something about the moment felt off, like the temperature had dropped even as the lights stayed hot. JD didn't even glance her way. He stood still and composed, his notes untouched. His hands never left the podium. The stillness wasn't passive, it was pressurized. He leaned forward slightly, not to advance, but to anchor. Thank you, Madam Vice President, he said, his voice calm, firm. And I do mean that. A pause, he meant it. Not as flattery, but as finality. I'm grateful for the clarity of your views, he added. The country deserves that. Then, seamlessly, without a beat of defensiveness, he pivoted. But while we're speaking about frameworks, let's talk about what happens when they collapse. A shift in tone, not louder, just heavier. In the last decade, 42,000 manufacturing jobs vanished in my home state. Not because our people got lazy, not because they lost faith in facts, but because we built policies on spreadsheets that forgot human faces. The laughter was gone now. The studio had cooled. Viewers at home leaned forward, drawn not by drama, but by the feeling that someone had stopped performing and started telling the truth. You want to talk about economic vision? JD continued. Mine is simple. We bring dignity back to work. We don't mock the people who still pray while they wait for a second shift to open. We fight for them like their worth isn't defined by where they sit on a quarterly report. He looked directly into the camera. We don't need new parables. We need to stop pretending our policies are morally neutral. The line didn't come with applause, but it didn't need to. It came with silence, the kind that lingers when something cuts deeper than expected. Kamala shifted slightly behind her podium, just a weight adjustment, but the camera caught it, a flicker in her confidence. She offered a composed smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The moderator thanked JD, signaled a transition. The show went on. But something had shifted, not in the script, in the atmosphere. The audience didn't move, but it breathed differently now. The air didn't rush with applause or jokes. It settled, like dust disturbed and then left to hang midair, waiting. By the time the segment ended, social media was already boiling. A 6-second clip of JD standing silent while Kamala grinned had been looped, captioned, and shared. No edits, no commentary, just stillness. His face, hers, the space between them. Caption, Grace under fire. Another user added, she came to win. He came to remind us what it costs. By the hour's end, a pastor in Georgia quoted JD's line on moral neutrality from the pulpit live stream. A veterans group in Michigan retweeted the clip. A youth choir in Oklahoma posted a response video, quietly reading Isaiah 5:20 over JD's moment of pause. He hadn't said anything radical. He'd simply refused to flinch. And in a room built to reward spectacle, restraint had become rebellion. The moderator didn't look up when she asked the question. She was reading from the script, but something in her voice betrayed hesitation, like she already knew this wasn't just another policy point. She glanced up mid-sentence. eyes scanning both podiums. Senator Harris, Mr. Vance, the next question may be broader than most, but perhaps more urgent. Her voice softened, ever so slightly. Has America lost its moral center? A subtle murmur moved across the audience, more felt than heard. It wasn't disapproval, it was recognition. A question too big for a timer. A question people had been asking themselves long before it reached the stage. Kamala's reply came smoothly, swiftly. I think when people say moral center, they're often reacting to discomfort, she began, adjusting her stance. What we're seeing in this country is a recalibration, not a collapse. We're more inclusive, more self-aware, and more prepared than ever to protect the rights of all Americans. That's not moral failure. That's progress. She smiled gently, confident. Then she added, moral centers evolve. That's how democracy breathes. It was the kind of answer that sounded complete, but it left the question untouched, hovering in the room like fog that hadn't been cleared, only stepped around. The moderator turned to JD. He didn't move. He didn't blink. And for a few long seconds, he didn't speak. The silence expanded, slowly, then noticeably. Not dead air, living air, charged, deliberate. It wasn't hesitation, it was consideration. Like someone taking a slow breath before walking into a fire. The cameras didn't know what to do with it. A director in the control room whispered, "Hold shot. Hold it." No one cut away. JD finally shifted his weight, not forward, but back. He stood upright, unshaken. His hand hovered above his notes, then dropped. Still, he didn't speak. In the fourth row, a woman gripped her husband's hand, sensing something about to break. At home, across the country, thousands of viewers leaned forward instinctively, not because they were prompted, but because something in the silence felt too human to ignore. Kamala shifted too, just slightly, not nervous, just alert, waiting. JD's eyes were fixed on the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. Not at the moderator, not at the crowd, not even at Kamala. He looked into the camera, straight through it, into living rooms, into union halls, into Sunday morning kitchens. And he didn't speak yet, because the silence had something to say. In a diner in Pennsylvania, a waitress wiped her hands on her apron and stopped mid-step. In a fire station in Kentucky, 3 men watching the debate in folding chairs didn't reach for their coffee. In a retirement home in Tulsa, a woman turned up the volume, not because she couldn't hear, but because she didn't want to miss what came next. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of judgment, of grief no policy had ever fixed. And when JD finally parted his lips to speak, it wasn't the beginning of a soundbite. It was the start of something else entirely. JD's lips parted, but no words came immediately. He let the silence hang a breath longer, not because he was unsure, but because he knew exactly what came next would not be forgotten. Then calmly, with a tone not of accusation but of warning, he spoke. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It landed like a hammer on velvet, soft in sound, unignorable in weight. There was an audible intake of breath from the audience, a ripple of shifting bodies. Someone in the 5th row actually gasped and didn't try to hide it. The moderator blinked, lost her place in her notes. Her eyes darted to the control booth, then back to JD. She opened her mouth to speak but found no immediate words. Her fingers gripped the side of her chair. Kamala Harris didn't move. She sat perfectly still, the practiced smile from earlier now gone, replaced with a look that was not fear, but recognition. Recognition that she had stepped into something older, deeper, and less controllable than she'd expected. JD didn't pause long. He continued. That's not religion, he said, steady and sure. That's remembering. The line hit like thunder wrapped in scripture. He wasn't preaching, he wasn't shouting, but somehow the verse spoke louder than any slogan had all night. He let the echo settle into the air. Then he added almost gently, you can change laws, you can rewrite policies, but you don't get to rename what's good and call it progress. His eyes didn't shift. He was speaking through the camera again, not to Kamala, not to the moderator, but to someone else entirely, To every American sitting in silence, feeling something they hadn't heard said out loud in years. You don't have to be a churchgoer to know when a line's been crossed. You don't have to quote the Bible to feel when the country's lost its compass. He looked down once, briefly, then back up. I just did. It was quiet in the studio. Too quiet for a live national broadcast. The sound team wasn't adjusting levels. The audience wasn't reacting. They were just still. Because something sacred had just entered a space built for performance, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Somewhere near the back, a woman folded her arms over her chest. Her eyes were glassy, not because she was religious, but because she remembered a time when a sentence like that wouldn't have been considered controversial. Just true. Kamala finally moved, only slightly. Her hand reached for her water glass, but she didn't drink. She just held it, as if to ground herself. The moderator cleared her throat quietly. Mr. Vance, she began, but her voice faltered. Would you like to continue your thought? JD didn't smile. He didn't bask in the moment. He simply finished. There's a difference between leadership and erasure, he said, between progress and forgetting. I'm not quoting scripture to divide this country. I'm quoting it to remind us who we used to be and who we don't have to stop being. He stepped back slightly from the mic, not to retreat, but to release. And in that moment, the line between faith and public life wasn't blurred. It was clarified. Not by doctrine, not by politics, but by the truth that still had the power to quiet a room full of noise. When the segment ended, the audience didn't clap, not out of disapproval, but because applause would have felt small. Some moments are too heavy for hands. They're made for memory, and this one would stay. The green room was silent, no typing, no whispers, no good job high fives. Kamala Harris's team stood clustered near the monitors, their faces dimly lit by the frozen frame on the screen. J.D. Vance, still at the podium, eyes unwavering, the final words of Isaiah hanging like dust in the air. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. Something had just happened. The comms director broke the stillness first. Do we have a real-time read on response? An intern nodded, scrolling furiously on his phone. We're trending, but it's not us. Define not us. He turned the screen around. Hashtag Isaiah 5, 20, hashtag he didn't shout, hashtag Vanceverse. The clip was already posted in 4 different edits, each one focusing on the same moment. JD's steady gaze into the camera as the words fell. Woe to those who call evil good. On one version, the caption read, he didn't raise his voice, he raised the bar. On another, he didn't fight back, he stood still, and that was enough. Kamala stood off to the side, arms folded, watching the muted monitor. JD was now walking off stage, not waving, not smiling, just walking, slowly, purposefully, like a man who had left something behind that didn't need an explanation. A senior strategist finally spoke. We underestimated how much silence weighs in a room like this. Another aide muttered, we weren't debating policy. He made it feel like a sermon. Kamala didn't speak. She kept her eyes on the screen, watching JD disappear down the side hallway. A runner offered her a water bottle. She declined. In the hallway behind the stage, JD walked with one staffer trailing 2 steps behind him, holding his coat. He didn't reach for it. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, far less glossy than the debate stage, but more honest. He walked without looking back. Not slow, not fast, just forward. Someone passed him on the way to the exit, a janitor in uniform pushing a cart of cables. The man nodded once. JD nodded back. That was it. No words, just recognition. By the time JD reached the back exit, the internet had already done its part. Twitter was flooded. Facebook posts began surfacing from pastors, parents, veterans. A small-town principal in Kansas posted a still image of the moment with the caption, "We'll be painting this verse on our civics classroom wall tomorrow." Late-night pundits paused their usual rhythm. One conservative host whispered on air, I didn't expect to be quoting scripture tonight, but there it is. A progressive commentator simply said, I don't agree with him, but I felt that. And somewhere in Iowa, a high school debate coach sent a clip to her students with the message, "You don't have to dominate a stage to own it." Back in the green room, one of Kamala's senior advisors offered a thin smile. "We'll recover. These things cycle fast." Another one replied, "Unless they don't." Kamala exhaled slowly. She wasn't angry. She was calculating, watching the narrative slip, not because of what she said, but because of what she hadn't been prepared to feel. "He used faith," someone said behind her. Kamala shook her head, still staring at the screen. "No," she said quietly. "He used memory." And at that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room. Tonight's winner wouldn't be decided by fact checks or polls. It would be decided by what stayed. And JD's words weren't going anywhere. The first letter arrived before sunrise. It wasn't official. No press email, no staff redirection. Just a handwritten envelope slid under the door of J.D. Vance's Senate office. No return address, just a shaky scrawl that read, "For the one who still remembers." Inside was a folded note on lined notebook paper. The ink had smudged in places. "You reminded me I'm not crazy. For a long time, I thought I was the only one who still thought right and wrong meant something. Thank you for not flinching. Please don't start." By noon, there were hundreds. By evening, thousands. His staff didn't know what to do with them at first. They started stacking them in boxes, then sorting by region, then topic. Emails poured in even faster. One aide printed out 82 pages of messages in a single afternoon and taped the best lines on the wall of the outer office, calling it the Isaiah board. One letter came from a retired teacher in Oklahoma. Inside, she had included a Polaroid photo of her classroom chalkboard. Written in crisp, practiced cursive were the words, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." Isaiah 5:20. Her note was short. "I taught civics for 27 years. This verse now opens the unit on integrity." A pastor and a rabbi from Michigan co-signed a typed letter of support. It wasn't dramatic or poetic. It was precise. "We do not always agree politically, but last night we saw something rare. A man who let conviction speak without contempt. That is not weakness. That is leadership." JD read that one twice. Then he passed it to his chief of staff without a word. From Appalachia came a handcrafted card made out of recycled cereal boxes. The handwriting was childlike, the spelling imperfect. "My dad said he ain't prayed in years, but he did after you said that thing about remembering." Other messages were more raw. "You gave my grandfather something to smile about before he passed. You're the reason I didn't walk out of church this week. I didn't think anyone in Washington remembered we still believe in anything." The letters didn't all come from the faithful. One email, signed anonymously, came from someone who identified as formerly religious. "I don't believe anymore. Not in the way I used to. But last night I believed in you. For one moment. That counts for something, doesn't it?" JD read that one the slowest. He didn't print it. He wrote it out by hand on a yellow notepad and folded it into his wallet. In a corner office down the hall, a young staffer stared at the ever-growing pile of messages, her fingers hovering above her keyboard. "It's not just the verse," she said softly, mostly to herself. "It's the fact that he never raised his voice." Another aide replied, "He didn't need to. The country raised theirs for him." Later that night, when the office was nearly empty and the mailroom was still working overtime, JD walked out of his office, past the Isaiah board, and paused. He read a note taped near the top corner. He didn't quote scripture. He echoed something we already knew and had forgotten. He stood there for a long time, long enough to feel what the country was feeling. Not anger, not pride, just the weight of being heard again. The room was warm with silence, too warm. Kamala Harris sat at the head of a long oak table, arms crossed, her expression a mix of steel and calculation. Around her, her senior aides avoided eye contact, flicking through tablets, refreshing data, pretending they still had control. But control had slipped sometime around midnight. An aide finally broke the silence. "We pushed too far." Another scoffed. "He was quoting a verse. That shouldn't be a political bomb." "But it was," the first one snapped, "because he didn't quote it for applause. He quoted it like he meant it." Kamala said nothing. Her hands were still, except for one thumb gently tapping the table. A quiet, steady beat, measured, tense. On the screen at the far end of the room, the headlines told the real story. Mocking faith, the moment that backfired. J.D. Vance didn't swing. He stood still, and America noticed. The smile that missed the country. Someone muted the television. The silence that followed was worse. A younger strategist scrolled through campaign donation dashboards, his face pale. We lost 6 major bundlers overnight. 3 more asked to reconsider our framing. Another added quietly, the donors liked the zingers until they made people cry. Kamala leaned back slightly in her chair. What's the damage on the interview tomorrow? Her communications lead hesitated. We recommend you cancel. The host plans to open with a segment titled Faith in Leadership. Where's the line? You'd walk into a buzzsaw. Kamala gave a half nod, her gaze distant. Cancel it. More silence, until her press secretary ventured gently. You could clarify. Say it wasn't aimed at all people of faith, just extremism. One of the senior aides shook his head. That won't work. The problem isn't the line, it's the tone. You laughed, Kamala. The whole country saw it. The words hung there, heavy, brutally honest. Kamala didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed, as if measuring a response that never quite came. Another aide pulled up social media reaction graphs. Even independent voters are shifting, not dramatically, but they're registering emotion. That clip, JD's restraint, it hit a nerve. Which means, someone added, he didn't have to win on policy. He won on presence. Kamala finally stood, slow and composed, walking toward the tall windows overlooking DC's skyline. She didn't say a word for several seconds. Behind her, the team waited, not for orders, but for direction, for anything. I was right, she said quietly. We are in a new century, but maybe we forgot that old truths don't expire just because they're inconvenient. No one responded. In that moment, the room felt like it had 2 versions of Kamala Harris. One still fighting, one already understanding. She turned back to face them. Take the heat off. Let the press breathe. No new sound bites, no damage control tour, just quiet. But the narrative, the press secretary started. Let it cool, Kamala interrupted. If we keep talking, we're just proving them right. For the first time in a long time, Kamala Harris looked not like a prosecutor, not like a candidate, but like someone watching a machine she built go slightly off course and realizing she couldn't fix it by spinning faster. That night, her campaign's social media channels went dark. No new statements, no clips, no clever one-liners. Just a pause. And across America, people noticed that silence too. The rain had slowed to a whisper on the windshield as J.D. Vance pulled his pickup into a small gas station on Route 33, just past the town of Nelsonville, the kind of place where time sagged a little and the air always smelled faintly of diesel and damp cornfields. The lights above Pump 3 flickered. The station itself looked like it had been last updated around 1994. Faded Coke posters in the windows, a bulletin board by the door covered in handwritten notes and lost dog flyers. J.D. stepped inside, shaking off the cold. The bell above the door gave a hollow jingle. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 60s, shoulders slightly hunched, gray hair pulled back in a frizzy ponytail. Her name tag read Nina. She was scanning items into the register for a young man buying a 6-pack of root beer and a lottery ticket. Nothing out of the ordinary until she looked up and saw him. She froze. The customer turned to glance at J.D., gave a polite nod and left without saying a word. J.D. offered a quiet smile. Evening. Nina blinked rapidly, then pressed a trembling hand to her chest. You're the man from the debate. J.D.'s smile didn't waver. I suppose I am. She stared at him for a long beat, then reached under the counter and slowly brought up something wrapped in a paper towel. It was a small, worn Bible, its black leather cracked, its gold-edged pages dulled by time and tears. My husband died last year, she said suddenly, voice shaking. Cancer. Quick. Cruel. We were married 42 years. Church people. Always. But after he went, I couldn't go back in there. Couldn't pray. couldn't feel anything. JD's hands stayed in his coat pockets. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. She kept going, as if the words had been waiting years. But when you said that verse, on that stage in front of the whole country, something opened up. Not everything, just something. JD nodded, his voice low. Isaiah 5, my grandmother's favorite. Nina gave a small, breathless laugh. Mine too. She used to whisper it when she thought no one was listening. They stood there, the humming of the drink cooler filling the silence between them. Then she slid the Bible toward him, opened to a blank page in the back. Would you sign it? JD hesitated for a moment. He had signed campaign posters, town hall flyers, copies of his book, but never a Bible. Still, he didn't flinch. He took the pen she offered and wrote in slow, deliberate strokes, For Nina, when truth is quiet, it still speaks. J.D. Vance. He closed it gently and pushed it back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. They think we're forgotten out here. But last night, I didn't feel forgotten. J.D. gave a nod, then looked down, unsure of what to say next. So he said what his grandmother might have. You were never forgotten. You were just waiting for the right moment to remember. The bell above the door rang again. Another customer. J.D. tipped his head and walked back into the rain, the door swinging closed behind him. Nina watched his taillights vanish into the fog, and for the first time in nearly a year, she pulled out that Bible and kept it open, not just for reading, but for remembering. The hallway outside the Capitol hearing room was marble cold and hushed with disapproval. J.D. Vance walked with measured steps, his briefcase tucked under one arm, flanked by two senior Republican aides who didn't bother with small talk. They led him into a side conference room on the third floor. Windowless, wood-paneled, too bright. Three party leadership figures were already seated at the far end of the long table. Ties stiff, posture stiffer. One of them was chewing a toothpick, not for flavor, but frustration. Senator Carlisle, the unofficial voice of discipline, leaned forward first. We've had calls from 6 donors in the last 24 hours. You know what they're saying? JD didn't answer. They're saying you made this personal, that you turned a policy debate into a pulpit. JD set his briefcase down slowly. I didn't turn it into anything. I answered a question. Another senator chimed in, a touch more clipped. You quoted scripture on national television to counter a sitting vice president. That's not policy, that's evangelism. JD blinked, calm, unshaken. She mocked my faith. I didn't respond with venom. I responded with truth. Carlisle cut in again. You're a politician, not a preacher. JD didn't hesitate. I wasn't quoting for votes. I was quoting for my country. The words hung there, heavier than any rebuttal they could offer. And yet, the air thickened. One of the aides slid a folder across the table. You're being pulled from the Economic Strategy Committee, effective immediately. Optics JD glanced at the folder, didn't open it. You're punishing me for restraint. Carlisle's tone softened, but only slightly. No, we're isolating a moment. Damage control. JD leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a second. Then he looked each man in the eye. You want polished. I gave you something else. I gave you backbone. That's not how we win Ohio suburbs. Maybe not, JD said, but maybe that's not what we need to win. There was no reply, just exchanged glances and unspoken warnings. He stood, picked up his briefcase, and started to walk out. At the door, he paused. You keep asking why people don't trust us anymore. Maybe it's because we sound more outraged by a Bible verse than by the silence we keep when folks lose everything. No one followed him out. In the hallway, a junior staffer whispered, Are they serious about removing you? JD didn't slow down. They already did. You gonna fight it? JD shrugged. I didn't take that seat to keep it warm. He disappeared around the corner, leaving behind the buzz of worried phones and the bitter smell of politics doing what it does best, defending itself from change. Outside, the air had turned brisk. A soft wind carried the sound of distant church bells. JD looked toward the sky. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just kept walking. The White House briefing room was unusually still. the tension tighter than the freshly starched collars in the front row of the press corps. Camera crews had arrived early. The lights were soft but unflinching. On the backdrop, the seal of the vice president gleamed beneath a row of muted American flags. Kamala Harris stepped up to the podium just past noon. Her hair was perfectly set, her navy blue blazer crisp, her heels clicking once before she stopped. She placed her notes down, exhaled quietly, and met the cameras head-on. "Thank you for being here." There was no opening joke, no small talk. She dove in. "In the past 48 hours, my words during the national debate have sparked a conversation, one that has gone beyond the original context. I want to address that directly." A pause, calculated. "Let me say this clearly. I respect faith. I respect those who draw strength from scripture, from prayer, from traditions old and sacred. I come from a family of believers." Her tone was measured, her expression still. But underneath there was a glint. Something clipped, coiled. But faith by nature is personal, and government, by design, must remain neutral. She scanned the crowd of journalists, then continued, voice firmer now. "We are a nation of laws. Our Constitution is not an altar. Our public offices are not pulpits. When we debate policies that affect millions of Americans, of all beliefs, we must ensure our arguments stand not just on passion, but on principle." Behind the curtain, her staff watched nervously, unsure whether the tone would soothe or stir further backlash. Kamala nodded once, signaling the close. "I may have spoken too bluntly, but I will not apologize for defending the wall between church and state." With that, she left the podium. The room burst into a flurry of clicks and murmurs. Headlines were already being written. That evening, across the country, J.D. Vance sat in a modest recording studio in Cincinnati. A podcast, independent, unscripted, and intentionally low production. The kind of setup with 2 microphones, a cluttered desk, and a loyal base of listeners who cared more about clarity than polish. The host, a former journalist turned independent commentator, leaned forward. "You heard her speech? Her team says this puts the whole thing to rest. Does it?" J.D. didn't answer right away. He shifted slightly, eyes focused, voice calm. "Government should be neutral, sure, but neutrality can't mean forgetting who we are." The host blinked. J.D. went on. "If a man speaks from his convictions, and those convictions come from faith, that's not a breach of separation. That's called being human. We're not robots. We don't draw our moral compass from a policy handbook." He paused, then leaned in slightly. "You know what's dangerous? It's not faith entering politics. It's pretending we can remove it completely and still lead with soul." The host sat back, thoughtful. J.D. finished with a quiet certainty. "People didn't connect with that verse because it was from the Bible. They connected because it reminded them of something they'd felt, but hadn't heard spoken aloud in years." By the end of the episode, comment sections were already flooding. "Finally, someone who talks like us. She lectures. He listens. She brought a knife. He brought a mirror." Across the divide, something deeper had been awakened. Not outrage, but reflection. The wind rolled down the hills of Hollow Ridge like it remembered the way. It carried with it the faint scent of iron, damp pine, and something older, something like memory. At the edge of town, just past the shuttered hardware store and the faded mural that once read, "We dig deep," the church stood still. Its roof had worn down to a dull, flaked rust. Ivy curled up its sides like fingers trying to hold on. But the bell tower remained, crooked but upright, as if defiant in its age. And then, without warning, the sound came. Clang! A pause. Clang! One more. Not hurried, not desperate, just clear. The sound of the bell hadn't been heard in Hollow Ridge in over 20 years. The last time it rang, a boy had left for war and didn't return. After that, the pulley broke. Or maybe someone broke it on purpose. No one remembered exactly. But today it rang again. No flyer had been sent out. No Facebook post. Yet one by one, they arrived. A miner with black under his fingernails, still in his boots. A nurse who just finished the night shift at the next county's ER. A grandmother holding the hand of a boy in a hoodie 2 sizes too big. A farmer in a muddy coat. A teacher with a notebook sticking from her purse. They stood beneath the bell tower, the sound still echoing faintly across the valley. No one spoke. There was no sermon, no politics, no music, just the wind and the fact that they were there, together. From a second-story window in the diner across the street, an elderly man watched. He turned to the young waitress refilling the sugar canisters. "You hear that?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to hear it ring again," he said. Back under the tower, someone set down a metal lunch pail, JD's father's, from decades ago. Someone else placed a folded flag beside it, and someone else, a Bible with a worn leather cover that had clearly been read more than once. Still no speeches. Some nodded, a few crossed arms. Most just stared ahead, as if they were waiting for something they couldn't name, but somehow trusted would come. In that stillness, the meaning wasn't in the words, it was in the silence, in the act of standing, when standing is all you can do. And then the boy in the hoodie stepped forward. He looked no older than 15, face still round with youth, eyes harder than they should have been. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. Read it once, then tucked it under the folded flag. He didn't explain what it said, and he didn't have to. Across the town that many had forgotten, a quiet ripple moved through shop windows, truck radios, and kitchen tables. People stopped what they were doing, not because they were told to, but because something, somewhere, had stirred. The bell had rung, and Hollow Ridge, for the first time in a long time, had listened. The hallway outside J.D. Vance's office had always been a pass-through. Neutral beige walls, overhead lights that buzzed faintly, footsteps that echoed too sharply on linoleum floors. But that morning it began to change. One by one, his staff started pinning letters to the wall. Handwritten notes, typewritten pages, crumpled envelopes from Indiana, Ohio, Missouri. Some arrived on official stationery. Others were scrawled on notebook paper, receipts, the backs of grocery lists. More than 300 in total, and still coming. They didn't arrange them by date, state, or party affiliation. They let them overlap, curl at the edges, fade in places. The imperfections felt right, honest. Near the center, one letter stopped everyone who walked by. It was written in trembling cursive. "I haven't been to church in 40 years, but when I watched that moment, I remembered what truth sounds like." No name, no return address. Just that. Another note taped beside it in bold block print. "You didn't preach, you just didn't flinch." Staffers quietly started calling it the real Congress. Not as a joke, but as something almost sacred. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a statement. A reminder that sometimes the real debates didn't happen behind microphones, but in kitchens, veterans centers, pickup trucks on back roads, and late-night living rooms. JD walked through the hall each morning without speaking, but his eyes always paused on different letters. Sometimes he traced the edges with his fingers. Once he leaned in and whispered, "This one feels like my mother." They never told the press about the wall, never posted it on social media. It wasn't for optics, it was for grounding, for remembering. The hallway wasn't quiet anymore, not because of noise, but because of presence. It felt full, like a chorus that didn't need volume to echo. It was a place for stories, for second thoughts, for those who had been waiting to be seen, and most of all, for those who realized that maybe, just maybe, their voice had made it all the way to Washington. The office was nearly dark, save for the soft flicker of a muted television screen. Washington's skyline stretched beyond the tall window behind her, but Kamala didn't glance at it. Her eyes were locked on the tablet in her lap. The screen paused on a frame that had been replayed more times than she could count. J.D. Vance, still, silent, staring ahead after she'd mocked his beliefs. No rebuttal, no fire, just that unsettling, steady stillness. She tapped play. "Woe to those who call evil good, and good evil." The words echoed again, softer this time. She didn't flinch. She'd seen this clip a dozen times, maybe more. But tonight, something different clung to the air. Not guilt, not even regret. Just a shift, a weight she hadn't named yet. Kamala leaned back in her chair, one arm draped over the side, the other resting across her stomach. Her breath was slow, measured. Her aides had gone home hours ago. No donors to impress, no audience to applaud. Just her, and the moment she couldn't outrun. She watched his expression again, calm, controlled, like someone who had seen storms before and chose not to add to them. She rewound it 10 seconds, watched again, rewound, played, rewound, paused. A whisper slipped out, not planned, just there. He never raised his voice. It wasn't envy. It wasn't admiration either. Not exactly. But there was something in his restraint that unsettled her. Not because it hurt him politically, but because it hadn't. Because the silence had spoken louder than the applause ever could. She set the tablet down on her desk, screen still glowing, then stood and crossed the room toward the window, arms folded, shoulders heavy. Outside, the lights of the Capitol twinkled under a blanket of midnight cloud. Inside, she stood still, not in defeat, not in pride, just in recognition of a man who said little, but made many listen. The bell had rung 5 minutes ago, but no one moved. The hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scratching of chalk were the only sounds filling the small-town civics classroom. Sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the rows of desks. On the front board, written in confident strokes, was a single line. Isaiah 5:20. The students stared. Some tilted their heads. One girl near the back finally broke the silence. Was he a preacher? The teacher, gray-haired, kind-eyed, turned from the board with a soft smile. No, he said, just someone who remembered what mattered and said it when no one else would. He let the words sit for a moment. A few students jotted notes. Others simply watched. You'll hear a lot of shouting in politics, the teacher continued. People trying to be the loudest in the room. But sometimes the person who whispers truth when it's hardest to hear, well, that's the one who changes things. He walked back to his desk, picked up a worn manila folder, and opened it to reveal a printed transcript. J.D. Vance's closing remarks from the now famous debate. He didn't read from it. He didn't need to. Instead, he said quietly, "Some stories don't end with a victory speech. They end with a question, one that follows you home." Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was thoughtful, full, like the room itself was still absorbing the weight of that moment, even after all this time. Outside, the flag fluttered lazily on the school lawn. Inside, a generation listened, not to noise, but to the quiet echo of conviction. And the chalk on the board didn't fade. It lingered, like truth often does. This story reminds us that strength isn't always loud. It can be quiet, resolute, and deeply rooted in conviction. J.D. Vance didn't need to shout to be heard. He stood firm in his faith, even when mocked, and let grace, not anger, speak for him. It's a powerful reflection on how true leadership often lies not in volume, but in values. And sometimes one calm voice can shake a room more than 1,000 raised ones. What about you? Have you ever witnessed someone respond to mockery with dignity instead of rage? What did it teach you about real courage? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.